Today we're in North Nottinghamshire. We're just outside the village of Sturton-le-Steeple. We've actually come down onto the marshland, the cars that run along the Trent Valley at this point. And we're looking for the lost village of West Burton. Now, for most people, they'll know West Burton as a power station. There's a huge power station here that was built in the 1950s. That's what people know West Burton as. But actually West Burton is a lost village. So we're going to try and find where the village is. Somewhere over here, probably near the end of the gas-powered power station, somewhere there, we hope to find what's left of this village that has disappeared. Well, I've walked about a mile along the catch water drain here. This is a drain built in the 1770s to help turn this area from marshland into productive farmland. Of course, I've got the power station close by, and I've got Sturton-le-Steeple village behind me. And Sturton-le-Steeple was very famous, particularly its great era in history, the 1500s and 1600s, when it produced the martyr John Lascelles, burnt at the stake in 1546, and then in the late 1500s, born there were John Smith and John Robinson, two of the great church separatist leaders of the early 1600s, who went to Amsterdam with the separatists in 1608. So it's a historic area, but I still haven't found West Burton village. So I've just crossed Swine Marsh Lane. That's one of the old lanes set out after the drainage of the 1700s, and presumably that indicates there used to be lots of pigs around here. Well, I haven't seen any pigs yet, and I'm still trying to find West Burton, so I'm going to have to carry on. I've come down off the path because there's a very helpful sign here, and it says public footpath to the site of West Burton medieval village. In fact, the old maps also show me that this little spot here is where we cross from the parish of Sturton-le-Steeple into the parish of West Burton. It's the beginning of the land that belonged to West Burton village. So I'm going to head off this way, even closer towards the power station as it happens. We're now at the entrance to the village of West Burton, and it's a place with absolutely fascinating history. So let's have a look what we can see from here. Obviously you can see the power station dominating the landscape, but in front of the power station is a slightly higher bank of land, and that's where West Burton village once stood. But here we're actually standing in what was once the River Trent, and you can see behind me the curve of the trees as they follow round what was once the riverbank of the Trent. So West Burton village stood right on the river on a little cliff of higher ground just above the waters. Later on we'll find out whatever happened to the River Trent, but for now we're going to go investigate the site of the village. So now we've arrived actually in the middle of West Burton village. As you can see, there's no houses or anything here today. But this site has been extensively investigated and studied, and what we know is that it was a small village right on the banks of the River Trent, which flowed just below the dip in the land down here. And the village was formed around several streets, like this one that I'm standing in, which ran down to the edge of the river. So maybe we can imagine there would have been a little quayside there, maybe some goods being handled, probably a pub or two to keep the boatmen fed and watered. Now, a little riverside settlement. And behind me further away you can see the little house platforms where houses would have stood. But in terms of its growth, we know that by the 1600s there were only 7 or 8 houses here and a little church, and it survived until the later 1800s. Well, I'm sitting here in the old graveyard of West Burton Church. Actually, I can look across. In front of me was exactly where the River Trent once flowed. It's now more than a mile away. And as you can see, there's no church here at all. West Burton was always a bit of an out-of-the-way place. It's one of the places where witchcraft persisted into the 1580s, for example, when we know a man was arrested for making wax images of his mother-in-law, and he wanted to get rid of her by putting a spell on her. That's the sort of place perhaps that West Burton was. But actually the really interesting time in this village really was about 1602, when the village was in the control and under the influence of the Wasteness family, a Puritan family who owned extensive property at Headon, a few miles away. And one of that family was the clergyman here. And maybe through his influence, two very famous people came to preach. In 1602, John Smith, who was a very radical clergyman, soon to become a separatist, he came to preach here. And in 1603, John Robinson, also to be a famous separatist, he came to preach here as well. So we have the man who founded the English Baptists and the man who was the leader of the Mayflower congregation, who both preached in this out-of-the-way place. But it was so small that it couldn't sustain a congregation. By the mid-1800s, there were only a few people here, and the church, basically a little chapel, was no longer really sustainable. In 1886, the church was demolished, and there's just the odd stone that you can find of it today. But you can find parts of the pews in one of the local churches, and the font from here was taken to Sturton-le-Steeple, where the church burnt down and needed a new font. So the font continues. Curiously to say though, at least until the 1920s, they would have an annual harvest thanksgiving on this site, and that must have been quite an event to come to. If we look around the graveyard, we'll find a few graves from the 1950s of people who lived on the scattered farms were buried here. But there's some great graves here. This is my favourite, this one, and it's one of the Billiald family, and he has a great little verse at the bottom. Christ is my life, death is my gain. My body sleeps in hopes to reign. Thrice happy change it was for me, from earth to heaven removed to be. An interesting little 18th century gravestone there. So we know from visiting West Burton village that it was a village that was on the river's bank, and actually some of the main streets in the village led down to the river. But I'm now standing in what was the river. So we've got a mystery to solve. This was actually part of a huge meander on the River Trent called the Burton Round. And it actually began about a mile over there, close to where the pumping station is that we'll visit later, came in a huge circle, and then really went back to almost exactly the same point it had started with. Just a few yards of land separated the two parts of the river. This place was so famous that Shakespeare had heard of it, and he used it in his play Henry IV Part 1. And in that play, Hotspur is having a bit of a debate about how they're dividing the land up between them. And this is what Shakespeare wrote. In the words of Hotspur in the play, methinks my moiety, my share of the land, north from Burton here, in quantity equals not one of yours. See how this river comes me cranking in, and cuts me from the best of all my land. A huge half moon, a monstrous cattle cant. I'd have the current in this place dammed up, and here the smug and silver Trent shall run in a new channel, fair and evenly. It shall not wind with such a deep intent to rob me of so rich a bottom here. Well, Hotspur never did dam up the river and create a new channel, but as you can see from the fact that it's no longer here, something dramatic did actually happen to it. So that's the next part of our investigation. We're now walking, well, round the Burton Round as it was. So remember, until 1797, this was the River Trent. Over here, we've got a huge bank of trees which have grown up more or less where the main channel of the river flowed. And then we can see here the catch water drain that we were walking along earlier on. That's using this route down to the modern Trent as well. And then if I look over to the fields to my right, I can just about discern a small bank, what's left of the original river bank, which of course has been ploughed out for years by the farmers ever since. Nonetheless, you can still tell that was once the bank of the River Trent. We've come getting on for a mile since our last filming point, and as you can see, I'm still following the catchwater drain, which is actually following the course of the old river, and we're heading off towards the pumping station, which you can see in the distance, and the pumping station stands in the neck of the bend, the little narrow neck of land that used to separate the enormous meander. So we've got the little bank here beside us still, which is all that's left of the original river bank on this side, and then over here you can perhaps see the hedge, which actually marks the other riverbank on the other side. So little signs of the mighty river that once flowed here. Well, we've nearly finished our walk around the Burton Round, and as you can see, we've reached the point where the catchwater drain meets the River Trent in this pumping station, and that was necessary because the water level in the drain was at much of the year lower than in the River Trent. The Trent is of course tidal and has some high floods. So now we've got a modern pumping station to help us, but we can still see the remains of the old river bank on this side, and indeed the remains of the old river bank the other side of the catchwater drain on that side. So we're right in the apex, if you like, of the Burton Round, and we're now going to go and see the river and look at this narrow neck of land that was breached in 1797 to separate off this enormous bend of the river. Well, this is just such an interesting place in the history of the River Trent. We're down on the Trent, just beyond the pumping station, and here is the river in front of me. And up until 1797, the river flowing downstream came from behind the camera that way, curved sharply round here and went off in that direction. Where we're standing is pretty well would have been the middle of the channel at that time, and it was actually the boundary between Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire. And the river went all the way round past West Burton and then came back again almost to this exact spot, just aligning really with the bend in the river behind me. The gap between the sections of the river here was said to be so narrow that a boatman coming down the river could throw his hat onto the bank as he came round this corner and then pick it up again as he came back round 2.5 miles later, having been all round the Burton Round. That was how narrow it was. And until 1797, that was the situation. But then after a period of flooding and high water, the narrow neck of land that separated the bend out was breached by the water. And of course, once having gone through, then this bend began to silt up. Actually, that created a little problem, because where I'm standing was the boundary between Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire. The land in the middle of the meander belonged to the Lincolnshire parish of Lee, and you could come down across those fields behind me, over the neck of land that had existed, and get into your fields in the middle of the meander. After this was breached, that was no longer possible, and so you had this land that technically belonged to Lincolnshire, which was stuck on the Nottinghamshire side of the river. And it took until 1902 for them to change that arrangement and make this all Nottinghamshire. So I could go from Nottinghamshire to Lincolnshire and then to Nottinghamshire again in just a few yards of walking. Well, we've come a couple of hundred yards downstream from the West Burton Round to another enormous meander, the Bowl Round. Well, sometimes it was actually called No Man's Friend, and it was called No Man's Friend for the very obvious reason that if you were a boatman, it was an enormous waste of time. You had to go around this vast meander in order to cover basically 20 yards distance, and where we were standing is in the neck of the meander, and you can see behind me the river flowing across this section, and that was the section that in 1795 disappeared. 1795 was one of the years of catastrophic flood that affected the Trent every so often. A period of very, very heavy frost that had frozen the ground was followed by a period of torrential rain that ran across the top. And that year, the River Trent came over the banks and flooded and washed away the narrow neck of land that separated out the Bowl Round. So we actually had another part of the Lincolnshire parish of Lee that was cut off from its own mainland, as it were, by the River Trent, the new course of the River Trent. And we can see where the Bowl Round flowed. There's an old flood dyke running through one section, and indeed another flood dyke further up. But we can also investigate what it's like today, because it's rather attractive compared to the West Burton one. We're now standing just about on the other side of the Bowl Round, just having crossed the neck. Over on my right, there's another one of these deep drainage ditches joining the Trent through a sluice here. And then we've got these two interesting walls, and they tell us a little bit about the history of the river, because this is probably the 18th century stone parapet of where the path along the bank crossed the dyke coming out that was draining the land. And of course this was a crucial height for flood defence reasons. And then we can see here later this concrete wall that's been built perhaps in the 1900s, which has raised the level of flood defence, because there was a number of occasions in the 20th century when the waters here overwhelmed the flood defences, and so this is the modern flood height. We've set off round the Bowl Round now, round no man's friend. And you might say, well, it doesn't really look like an old river course at all. It doesn't look very much like the West Burton Round, in fact. Obviously, this is very, very different. It's completely covered with woodland and wetland. It's actually something of a nature reserve here. But we can see these ancient trees on the side of the path, which line the banks of the old river. And then over on my other side, this ground is actually where the river would have flowed. But it's not very obvious here. We're going to go further round and see a place where perhaps you can imagine it much more clearly. And actually we should point out, if you came here in winter time, often this area is still flooded, and it's a lot easier to remember it and think about it then. So let's see what else we can find. Well, here you can see much more obviously this used to be a river. In fact, there's plenty of water only just over here, and you can see it curving round behind me towards the village of Bowl, which actually stood a little bit further back from the river, not quite like West Burton. And this is a beautiful place. The birds are singing, there's a nice grass path through Bowl Round. It just makes a great place for a pleasant afternoon out. So we hope you've enjoyed our trip. We're going to head off back to the car and get ready to finish our video.